The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and good afternoon. This is Mark Kovich. I'm a System Sales Specialist for IBM. I am part of the IBM Internet of Things Continuous Engineering Organization. Thank you for joining the webinar today on Unlocking Doors, an Introduction to DXL. Today presenting is George Ciampos. He's a Technical Sales Specialist with IBM. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that you're in listen mode only and that this webinar is being recorded. We will have a question and answer session at the end of George's presentation. I'd like to point out the question box in your control panel. There's a little plus sign that says questions. Click on that, it'll open up. You can submit a question, it'll come directly to me, and we will save your questions for the Q&A session after George's presentation. He will be doing a little bit of demo on this webinar, but not a lot. Your questions will be saved in chronological order, and as usual, what I will do is I will reply back to your question and let you know that your question is coming up next so that you can be aware that we're going to ask it, and then you can pay attention to George's answer. Also, I'd like to make mention that in the past I've disclosed to you the IBM website and when we archive all the Enlightenment Series recordings. The older recordings are still there. However, the recent recordings over the past couple weeks are not. We are going to a new system. In the interim, we are archiving all the recordings on the GoToWebinar website. I will send all registrants an automated email from GoToWebinar that will indicate the actual link on where you can view the recording. If you would like the presentation, just reply to me and I'll be happy to send you George's presentation. Or if you like the presentation right now, if you look in your control panel, there's a little plus sign that says handouts. Just click on that and you can download the presentation that George is going to use here momentarily right now. So if you want to go ahead and archive it, please do so. With that said, I think that pretty much covers it. So George, you go ahead and start.
Thank you, Mark. And I'll add my welcome to Mark's. Thank you all for taking the time. I hope by the end of this you'll learn something that you don't know already about DXL. As Mark said, I'll try to answer some questions towards the end. And also, if you, as I'm going through, if you see something that you'd like to have clarified right away, go ahead and get that to Mark. And if it's something that he thinks I can handle right in line, I'll do that. Okay. So DXL. DXL is the, as you can see from the title slide there, is the Doors extension language. If you look at the Doors product and you could peel it back, at its core you would see the DXL interpreter. So if you can imagine, the Doors product was, the interpreter was sort of the first thing developed in the Doors product, and then the functionality was built using that. So when you look at the Doors product, everything you see, or I'll qualify that and say, you know, very close to everything you see in Doors can be done in DXL. So you click on a module, it opens in a window, you see objects, all of that can be done with DXL. As the tool evolved, some of the functionality came out of the scripting language and then was coded into the core product. So you don't see everything anymore, but if I could go back to very early versions of Doors, you would see that the DXL functionality was everywhere. It was ubiquitous inside of the Doors product. So the nice thing about that is that the language is very robust. You know, usually if you ask a question, can I do this in DXL, the answer is almost always yes. It's just a matter of actually getting it coded. So with that, as a little bit of an introductory comment, we're going to go through, talk about you know, just the language a little bit, some of the basic constructs of the language, and then how to actually execute it inside of your Doors client. And then I'll try to take a look at some of the more typical kinds of DXL that you come across. It's not in this agenda here, but I do plan to talk about the DXL that's written by the analysis wizard. So something that you all probably use from time to time. The scripting language, as I was saying, can be used for just about anything relating to the tool. Because of the way the data is structured in DOORS, a lot of times DXL is written for DOORS administration. If you try to maintain a consistent set of attributes across modules, if that's a desire of yours, or any, for at least in the past, whenever there was a need to report across modules, DXL would usually be the answer to that. So handling user information, sort of limiting what plugins a user might be able to run, all of that is handled in DXL, and we could call that sort of DOORS administration. Your traceability columns are also implemented in DXL. We'll have a chance to talk about that. Any sort of calculations you might need, or any sort of GUI improvements that you might want, can be written in DXL. For a long time, Motorola had used DXL, and they had written a customization that was so thorough that a user might not recognize that it was the DOORS product that was actually doing the calculation. And so they had managed to manipulate the displays of the data and all sorts of things. When we talk about DXL, the language is the language no matter where you write it in the tool. However, it runs in some slightly different contexts. Most of the time, if you're going to write a script that would go through and calculate metrics, let's say count a number of requirements or something like that, those are the sorts of scripts that are either launched from within a module or within a project. So they run in a particular context where the DXL interpreter knows what the user has open. I'll have a chance to talk about that a little bit. We also talk about layout DXL. Layout DXL is not a different type of DXL, so the language is the same, but only the context is different. I can write DXL that will display information in a column, and in that case, the context again is different. The script knows what the current object is for a column, or the current object in the module for which it's going to calculate a result in a column. You can also write DXL attributes, so create a field in the database whose value is populated by a script. That again also runs in a particular context, and there are slight differences between the contexts, but 99% of the language is the same in any of these cases. On this list, we could also write perhaps a fourth context, which is a DXL trigger. The DOORS client can trigger scripts to run on particular events. So if you wanted a way to perhaps check whether or not an object has a particular attribute set to a particular value, you could do that when the user edits the object or when the user leaves the object. Okay. At a very high level then, a DXL script is just a text file. So you write the language in a text file, and then that gets presented to the DXL interpreter. You can write the script using a very I'll call it a Spartan editor inside of the DOORS product. It's very basic, basically the equivalent of Notepad. Or you can use something that is a little nicer. I'll actually be using something called the Crimson editor. It is a free editor, and it has DXL color coding, so it'll help you while you're learning the language. If you want to use the editor inside of the DOORS product, from a variety of places, you can go under typically your tools pull-down menu, and you'll see an option to edit DXL. And then what you'll get is a very, as I mentioned, a very Spartan-looking notepad. The top area is used to actually write the script. The bottom area will show you any output that you print. So that the output window down below is what we might call standard out. You can also tell from the buttons across the bottom that you can easily browse to a script and load it, and then perhaps make changes to it and click Run. Also, the DXL interpreter will give you some feedback on the errors you have. This is a great way to learn how to write the language while you're starting out. Eventually, the DXL interpreter, find that it shows you only basic things. You'll be able to pick up when you haven't closed brackets and that sort of thing. But it's not very rich in terms of a debugger, something that if you code a lot you may be used to, where you can do a subroutine and watch the execution of a script line by line. We don't have that capability developed. So if I were to open up a window and write just a simple line, the print statement will print in the output window. So if I wanted to write this string, hello DXL programmers and enthusiasts, that's how it would appear in the output window. And then some of the things that you might get, so that's the basic hello world statement in DXL. Now, the DXL interpreter will help you when you're writing and perhaps you make some syntactical mistakes. The thing to remember is that the DXL interpreter basically understands everything as text, so it's entirely text-based. If I remove one of the double quotes from this statement, I'll get a variety of errors, and the first thing you notice is that it assumes that because the quotes are not closed, that I've got a badly formed token to begin with, but then it goes through and finds undeclared variables, which of course you didn't mean to be undeclared variables. So all of this in one shot might not immediately make you think, oh, I haven't closed the quotes. But as you develop experience with the interpreter, you'll find that, yeah, that's what happens here. When I see all that, if I look at a text string and I see that the interpreter is trying to understand it as a variable, then I probably haven't closed it in quotes somewhere. There is also help available right inside your DOORS client. The DXL reference manual is there. In earlier versions of DOORS, we had this, I forget what the application is called, but it's basically a Microsoft technology that allows you to search for functions, and you'll see help presented in this sort of fashion for a variety of tools. I think now, if in 9.6, if you click on help, you actually get kind of an Eclipse-based plugin help. And then I apologize, I haven't clicked on the help in a while. So, okay. So with that, let me just bring up DOORS real quick, and we'll have a chance to talk about this. So here I am inside of my Database Explorer. If I click Tools, Edit DXL, I can type print hello world, no semicolon or anything on the end of that line, and I click Run, and I get the output just like we saw in the slides. Now I can, and we'll get to this in a minute, if I turn around and I ask the DXL interpreter, what's the current object? I'll get a null object parameter passed. I'm going to talk about what I did just here, but the first thing I want to point out is that because of where I was in the tool when I executed this command, the DXL interpreter doesn't know anything about a current object. So the null object parameter was passed to the argument position 1, and the DXL halted. Now, if I do that same thing, suppose I open up a module, one that has something in it. Now, if I do that same thing inside of a module, Tools, at a DXL and I declare an object and then I print the identifier for that object, well, now I get MR6. So there's a difference between running inside of a DOORS module as opposed to back in the Database Explorer. So make sure when you're writing it, one of the first things you want to consider is the context. Where do I expect the user to run this thing? If I expect them to be inside of a module, then I know that there's a current object that I'll need to make use of. If they're not going to be inside of a module, then I will have to handle the opening and closing of modules myself in the script, which I can do. Okay. The DXL reference manual has a lot of good stuff in it. Go ahead and spend some time with that. If you have programming experience at all, it will most likely be enough for you to open up the DXL reference manual and to look through, just take a glance through how the commands that are used. And then you're going to want to become familiar with all of the for loops that are available. So DXL is a procedural language. In other words, you write it like C or even earlier than C, Fortran or anything like that. It is not object-oriented. So the idea of declaring an object and having methods that you apply to it, that is not available in DXL. Because DOORS is a database tool, a user might expect to be able to use SQL or something like that to be able to get to the data. And there again, SQL is not supported. For some people, that's good news. The DXL is a procedural language, so you won't be able to make queries and joins and all that sort of thing. So then how does a procedural language access records in a database? Well, it accesses them by going through a series of collections. And basically, inside of DXL, there's a for loop for just about every kind of collection you can imagine. If I want to loop through all the objects in a module, there's a structure for object in module. If I want to loop through modules in a project, there's a for loop for modules in project. And so on, all the way down the road. Users in the database, attributes in an object, you name it, there are collections for everything. And that's how you're going to go through and access the records. When if you're in a position to administrate DOORS, you'll want to take some precautions. Whenever a user is writing DXL, especially if they're not very good at it, they can make manipulations to the database that will create a lot of problems if they're not careful. So if you are in a position if you yourself are developing DXL scripts, you'll want to do those in a sandbox. If you are helping others that are developing scripts, you'll want to make sure that there are access controls in place to prohibit certain users from running certain scripts. All of those things can be managed by opening up the properties of the DOORS database root. So log in as the administrator, right-click on your DOORS database icon and open the properties, and you'll come to this dialog box. Up at the top, there's an option to prohibit users from running DXL who have not been given specific permissions. If you're in an environment where a lot of this is going on, this is a very valuable checkbox. And then below it, you'll see there are options to enable certain DXL restrictions. And you see a variety of fields for an add-ins path, a layout path, and so on. These paths are locations out on the file system where DXL scripts will reside. By limiting the add-ins path, for example, you're forcing the user of this client or actually you're forcing the user of every client, because you're doing this as a database property and as the administrator, you're forcing every user to only execute the scripts that are in a particular location. So the top option either allows or not allows a user to open up that Edit DXL window and write their script. And then these other options allow, if you're going to give somebody the ability to run DXL, then I want them to only run the DXL that's in this location. I don't want them writing any of their own. I don't want them running anything outside of this particular folder. And then, of course, the last step of that is to make sure that everything that goes into that folder is thoroughly tested and is not going to break anything. And then when you're managing the user, the Edit DXL permission you actually see on the list of powers for that user. For those of you who are not administrators, you may have never seen this dialog box, but this is basically how we add users to the DOORS database. Down at the bottom, in addition to giving them abilities like create projects and that sort of thing, we can let them edit DXL or not. All right. So so that's a little bit about sort of getting control of DXL in a practical environment, things you can do to help administrate it. Outside of that, if you're familiar with, as I mentioned, a procedural programming language, you're going to find that DXL is pretty easy to use. If you do have experience with C, you're going to recognize a lot of things right away. So all of the basic types you would expect to have are available in DXL. Integer values, real values, strings, booleans, the whole bit. We do declare variables, even though it is an interpreted language. You do have to declare your variables inside the DXL. Now, all of these basic types, when you're writing DXL, these types that are common to many program languages, the type declarations will always be with a lowercase first letter. So when you're declaring a string, notice down here at the bottom, the string S my name equals Don Cunningham. The word string there is with lowercase. There are, in addition to those basic types, there are many types that are specific to DOORS. These are things you would not see in another programming language. Those types always begin with a capital letter. So an item in DOORS is a generic reference to just about anything in the database, any data item in the database, I should say. So an item can be a folder, a module, a project. And then there are specific types for those other things. So just looking at this, for example, when in the little example I did before, I declared an object O, and I used a capital O in that declaration. So in addition to understanding those for loops, you're going to use those along with conditional statements to do your first several programs. So a basic if-then-else construct. For example, if I was going to declare a couple variables, A equals 3, B equals 5, and then I want to print if A is greater than B, it would look something like this. Just right up at the top of the window, int, since it's a common type, I write that with a lowercase I. A equals 3, B equals 5. If A is greater than B, then print the string A greater than B, otherwise print A less than B, and you see A less than B has printed down here. So you could do it like that, or you could also open up a more full-featured editor. So here is the Crimson editor. And it's, I think this is no longer supported, but if you were to go out and Google the Emerald editor, something like this. If you Google Emerald Editor, you'll find either this very same editor, or maybe some of the branding is different, but this is basically it. When you get it, the first thing you'll want to do is set up under Preferences. You can actually set up syntax files. And I think I'm going to, so you can actually, there's a syntax type available for the DOORS extension language. So the editor, you'll download it, and then a couple other files, and you'll find that you can put in this file that'll give you the color coding for DXL. So the example in the PowerPoint slide here is a simple example, something you might want to write directly in the tool. When you go to develop more complex scripts, you'll want a specific editor. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how you might want to set up your environment. Back here in DOORS, I mentioned, and I'm not logged in as the administrator, so let me switch to being the administrator.
George, while you're doing that, I just want to remind all the attendees that questions are rolling in, that I'm going to reply to you and let you know, not George, I'm not going to reply to you, George, I'm going to reply to the attendee who asked the question to let them know that the question is going to be asked and that they can pay attention to the answer. So for the attendees who are asking questions, if you don't hear from me right away, don't worry. I will reply to you when we get to the Q&A session. So you can proceed, George. Sorry for the interruption.
No, thank you for clarifying that. So I'm inside of DOORS now, and I'm logged in as the administrator. And so if I go to those database properties that we saw on the earlier slide, and I go to DXL Security, I have enabled a restriction to use this folder called See My DXL Addins. When you set up a folder like this, let's just take a quick look at that folder. So here it is, My DXL Addins. Now, something that I did not put in the slides, and perhaps should have, so let me explain this more slowly. You can make DXL scripts available using these paths, as I mentioned. However, there is a particular criterion that the folder has to have. So this is the path to the folder, and then here it is in the file system. Here it's on my C drive. In practice, you would most likely have that going out to some kind of a shared drive. So you would see, 2 slashes, the machine name, and the share folder. But if I go out here, when I go into the My DXL Addins, you see a help file called My DXL Addins. If the DOORS client does not see that help file there, then this is not a valid DXL Addins folder. So that is actually necessary. For example, if I go over to my client and I open up a module, product requirements, you see that inside my module there's a menu here that you don't normally see called DXL. This menu is constructed from this folder that is inside of my valid DXL folder. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. Do I have a way to annotate that? So in other words, this, oh, well, okay, I'm sorry, it looks like it's not going to let me annotate that the way I wanted. This menu, DXL, labeled DXL menu, is exactly this folder here. This would not have appeared inside the module if that help file were not there. So the basic rule is all of my DXL add-ins folders must have, a path in the file system, and they must have a help file inside of them that has the exact same name as the folder. So the help file has to be called My DXL Add-ins, and this DXL menu folder, this is also an add-ins folder. If I open this up, again, you see the help file called DXL menu. And then here is actually the script. So that file, my DXL script, then, is actually this text file right here. Notice that when I write it, I open with a single line comment that's denoted by 2 slashes followed by a block comment. If this header is not there, Doors will not display the actual script in the menu option. So then, what I have here is a single line script. This ACK function that I'm going to use basically shows this message. And so if I want to make it available to a user to run, then inside of my Doors module, I pull down my DXL menu and I click My Sample DXL Script, and I get this dialog box that says, this is your first DXL dialog box. And that's being generated right here. So that's how I can make a script available to somebody to use, directly through the interface, rather than going into the editor and trying to write something. Okay. So then, let's talk a little bit about these for loops that were mentioned. These for loops can go through the kind of typical thing that you're used to seeing. So if you're familiar with these languages, you can loop through something a number of times, and that's fine. All of that still works. So this example down here on the slide, if for start equals 0, while start less than end, increment end, then the value equals start plus value, then you actually see that this will print sort of the sum of numbers 1 through 5. You can do that. However, you can also use this same construct when you're trying to go through, let's say, objects in a module. So let's talk a little bit about that. I'm going to open up my Crimson editor again, and instead of running this, I'm going to comment out this line. A comment in DXL, a single line comment, is 2 forward slashes. So my editor turns that green, and now I can come through and do something else. So this, remember, this is running inside of a module. So I can declare an object variable obj, and then I can loop through all of the objects in a module, just like we use a for loop to loop through that summation script. So I can come down here and I can say for obj in module, do the following. Okay? So if you're not used to seeing DXL, take a second and wrap your head around this. I declared an object variable, so basically obj will hold a reference to an object in this module, And then I'm using a keyword here for object in module, and module has a capital M in that case. And I could say, maybe to be more clear, I could say current module. So the module with a capital M gives me a reference to a module. It's just like declaring the variable. Current module means the one that is current right now. So for every object reference in the current module, do something. And I'm going to say, I'm going to pull a little bit of a trick here. I'm going to say print. Now normally when you're writing inside of a text editor like this, you don't say print because there's no place to print to. But this is actually going to be picked up by the DXL interpreter, and it's going to put the output in the output window. So I'm going to print the a string object identifier colon. All right. When you want to concatenate strings in DXL, you can simply use a space. So I'm going to print a concatenated string object identifier space, and I'm going to get the identifier of obj, and then I'm going to put in another space, and I'm going to put in a new line, which is just an escape \n, and then I'm going to close my brackets. So if I did everything right, I'm going to save this. That writes it into the file, and then inside my DOORS module, I'm going to click My Sample DXL Script, and DOORS is going to open up the module, and you see it prints object identifier PRD1, PRD46, PRD2. Now, notice something here, that the order in which it printed them is exactly the order in which they appear. In fact, let me just go back to my standard view, and I'll get the identifiers that way also. So PRD1, PRD46, PRD2, okay? So the modules get processed in what we call depth first order. That's basically the order that's dictated by the structure in the module. So section 1 before 1.1 before 1.2, basically children before siblings is the order that they're presented in. Now, it did that because of the current view. If I were to switch the view and then run that same script, you would see that they're actually presented in a different order. Let me just, so if I sort by absolute number, okay, and then I come over here and I run my script again, you see that they are processed in the order in the view. So when you're writing DXL, again, you want to be careful of the context and what the current view is. If I were simply going to count these objects, I wouldn't have cared what order they're in. If I'm printing out the identifiers, it might make sense to worry about the view. So, Mark, by now I'm imagining that some people have some questions. Is there anything in the chat?
Yeah, we can ask some questions if you'd like to go through some. Let me do this here. Okay, so first, George, comment here, question. There are hundreds of homegrown, commercially developed DXL scripts available on the internet, most from what I have seen. What is the best and richest source of these DXL scripts? Do you have any comment about that?
I can't talk about everything in general. However, I will say, let me say this. There is a Jeremy Dick, Dr. Jeremy Dick, actually, was a longtime consultant for QSS and Telelogic, and I think he has since, I forget when exactly he left the company, but he wrote a lot of DXL, and I believe he made them publicly available. Anything from him would be outstanding. You know, he is, in all the years I've ever worked with him, he's very thorough. There's also, I believe, a guy out on the West Coast, I forget his name right now, but he put up a website called, I think, Baselines Inc., and he also put some of his scripts out there. He, I believe his background is, he's kind of a consultant and administers DOORS databases for a lot of people out west. And so his scripts have been developed under practical circumstances as well. Those two, and I apologize that I can't remember the site that Jeremy was posting his scripts on, but those two come to mind. There may be others as well. All I can really say is, you know, test everything you get, obviously, even if it's from Jeremy or the Baselines Inc. website. You know, test it out. Make sure you understand what it does, to be perfectly honest. I know for myself that I had written a lot of scripts for customers while I was on an airplane, and I was happy to deliver little bits of functionality, but there's a difference between developing in sort of a more professional way, where you're thoroughly investigating every possible use case for the script, and developing in more of a, what you might think of as a hacking mode, where you're just trying to get some basic functionality out. So, you know, so thoroughly test everything you're getting. You know, the tool's been around a while. There are a lot of people who are very good at DXL, so the odds of getting a good script are good, but just test everything.
George, what is the attribute add-ins path? The comment here says, I'm familiar with add-ins, project add-ins, and layout add-ins ones. So is there a
Excellent question. The attribute add-ins path is not so well known. For somebody who might not know, whenever you go to create an attribute inside of DOORS, you have the chance of using a script, a DXL attribute. If you browse, you get a short collection of scripts. Now, by default, this collection is actually in the client. So if I go and I open up, my install path for DOORS, I've got the 64-bit version of the client installed. So I'll go under here, 9.6, live DXL, a trib, and these are those scripts. So this is the default attribute add-ins path. Now, if I go back and I add, I'm going to go back to here, for example. If I go back to my DXL security and I add in, let's say I take that path right there, and I put it in my attribute add-ins path, what I expect to see is that when I go back into my module and I go to attempt to create an attribute and use a DXL script, that I'm actually, so it didn't refresh. If I close my client and start again, what I would expect to see then is another collection. You would actually see another folder down here that represents my DXL add-ins, and then you would see that one script that I put in there. Let me go ahead and do that, and then we should see what I'm talking about. So then inside the module, I'll just open user needs, edit attributes, and now, and because I didn't follow the rest of the convention, you do see the script in there. You don't see the folder properly named. So the naming of those things actually happens using an index file, which I haven't bothered to explain to you or use. Obviously, in our default locations, that has been set up properly. But you can see that the comment here is precisely the single line comment from my script. So basically, when you use that attribute add-ins location, you are making scripts available to a user within this dialog box. And you can use the first single line comment to describe in more detail what the script is going to do.
George, can you limit DXL privs to modification of DXL only, or are privs at a all or none option for DXL?
I'm not completely sure I'm understanding the question, but let me take a crack at it, and maybe the asker will tell me if I'm going wrong. So the DXL scripts live in the file system, and as such, they are subject to the permissions in the file system. So if I wanted to come over here, and let me get back to my add-ins folder real quick.
It says here, let me give you some additional comments by this asker. We generate layout DXL using Wizard, then can't change without DXL privs enabled. Does that help clarify?
Yes. So okay, thank you for that. So the way to handle that then, so I think the short answer then is that no, it's an all or nothing thing. So I think what they're asking, to put it another way, is can I let a user modify layout DXL or even a specific layout DXL script without letting them modify other scripts? And the answer to that is no. Now, the only thing I could possibly suggest is that when somebody takes away the DXL privileges, they're trying to protect the data. And unfortunately, the different DXL contexts, although they mean something to the person writing the script, the scope of those scripts is not at all restricted. So in other words, I can go and write a layout DXL script that can manipulate module data. You know, that would be kind of the dumb way to do that. But if somebody were to be malicious, they could do that. In other words, the data in the database is not protected from a DXL script based on the context in which that script runs. And that's why the privileges are kind of an all or nothing thing. If you're going to trust somebody to write to run the DXL, then you're basically going to trust them to not go through and make horrible manipulations. And if you give it to them in any one context, you haven't protected the data. So you have to give it to them in all contexts.
Would you like to go to more questions, or do you want to continue on with your presentation, George?
I'll go ahead and continue. We're, I guess, 10 minutes from the top of the hour. I do want to get through a few other things. And then we'll take some more questions there at the end. All right. So this slide, what talks about the DXL timeout. I don't know that that's all that important. The iteration statement that I just showed you an example of, the ability to loop through objects in a module, you see here another example. So notice it's roughly the same syntax. It's for something in something else. If I were to write this statement in a more generic way, I would say it's for an item in a collection, whatever that collection might be. And here, by the way, I'm not using the word collection the way we use it in Doors Next Generation. I'm using it in the sense that normal people use the word collection. It's just a bunch of stuff. So objects in a module can be looped through, modules in a project can be looped through, attributes in an object, attributes in a module, all of that can be looped through. Okay, so a script counting requirements might look something like that. All right. So from here, well, I'm sorry, hopped out of that a little too quickly. You can create functions in DXL. So as a way to structure your programs, again, if you're familiar with the C programming language, it works very much the same way. You make a declaration for the function itself, and then you can call it. So there's an integer function max. By declaring it as an integer function, you mean that it returns an integer. So I've got an integer function max that, oh, I guess I can't use the annotation there. Apologize for that. Up at the top of this screenshot, the max function takes two integers A and B and returns whichever one is bigger. You can see the if test, and then there's a similar function there for an array. And then a little further down, you can, well, if we could scroll down, you would see that the max array function is being called and what that call looks like. So just a little bit about the different constructs in DXL. We're going to talk also a little bit about some of the different contexts. Inside of a layout DXL column, you can use the display function to actually display a result. So if you insert a column, you can click the Layout DXL button and click Browse, and you'll come into a library of Layout DXL scripts, just like we saw with the Attribute DXL scripts. And then if you click Edit, you'll see again the same editor. You can write your script in there, or of course you can copy and paste a script in. So a typical Layout DXL script might look something like this. There's a declaration. All of these are real values, real, and the identifiers are probability. And then notice the way that the attribute value is accessed. It is obj dot and then m underscore probability. M underscore probability in this example is the name of the attribute, and then obj is defined in the context to mean the object for which the value is being calculated. So M probability and M severity are attributes. This Layout DXL script is basically calculating the product of those two, and then it's displaying the result. All right. So if I were to do that here in real life, let me hop to a different module. And so if I'm doing hazard analysis for medical devices, let's say, I've got a module that I might, an FMEA that I might want to open. And I've got a couple of scripts running that will calculate a value. So I've got an RPN. If I look at the properties of that column, we see that it is an attribute. Right next to it, I've got a dynamic column that's actually calculating that value. And if I open up the properties here, we see this is a layout DXL script. If I click Browse and then Current, this is the script that's being displayed. So this is a little more elaborate than the example we just saw, but it does illustrate the point. I've got a couple of declarations here: RPN, severity, probability, and DET. Those are all attributes in this module. And then I basically create a buffer with an RTF header in it. Don't worry too much about that. This is the thing that's making me, this is what's allowing me to display it in red. Basically, that's not really the point here. But I calculate the RPN using just the common notation in most programming languages. To multiply two numbers together in DXL, you use an asterisk. And then I go through, and if the RPN falls in a particular range, I'm going to copy this into a new file here, so I think it'll be easier to see. So I do the calculation using an asterisk, and then I determine whether or not it's in a range. So if it's greater than or equal to 30, we set the warning value to high, and then I basically shade the value. Otherwise, I'll set the warning to null, and I'll remove the shading. So the way that works in practice then, so right now that value 400 is being calculated by this 5, this 8, and this 10. If I double click in here and I modify the 10 to 5, the warning is still high. If I modify it to 1, oh, it's still 40, and I'm going to change that to 7, or no, 4. And then when it changes to 20, the shading goes away. And then the example that I was showing in the PowerPoint slide showed the display function. Here I used a slightly different function called display rich. The display rich actually uses the RTF notation, so I have to do that in order to make use of this header where the colors are defined, and then this highlighting that I'm putting on it. Okay. All right, with that then, attribute DXL, something similar. I won't go through an example here, but again, you navigate down through the library. We saw, I did this earlier. Here again, the OBJ context is defined for you. So in other words, not only is the context defined, but also the name of the attribute is available. And I forget off the top of my head what the keyword is for that. But I can create a DXL attribute, for example, and I don't have to know the name of the attribute that will be used in order to populate the value. You may have noticed that the names of these attributes appear when I reference them, but the context for an attribute DXL script allows me to forego that with a specific keyword, which I don't have here in the slide. All right, so A question came up about the analysis wizard. I do want to talk a little bit about this in case you do want to make modifications to your analysis wizard. The person earlier asking about the permissions on the layout DXL had a very good point. When layout DXL is typically used, all it is ever doing is displaying information. It's not manipulating information. However, because the context does not protect you from manipulating information, it's still under the same permissions. So when you create a layout DXL column using the analysis wizard, basically, I'm sure everybody on the call has done this. You've gone through, the wizard asks you a couple, 3 or 5 questions, asks you what you want to see about the linked information, and then the wizard itself writes a DXL script and puts it in a column. And I know, don't try to read this. It's obviously too small to read. But I want to point out basically how it's constructed and how you can make use of it if you're going to. If you need something that the layout script is not giving you, you can get in and manipulate what the script wrote, assuming that you have permissions. So the script breaks down into basically 2 blocks. A block that does the declarations, and then a block that does the processing. The processing block has a sub-block that is probably the most interesting part of this. Up at the top, for a given object, the script will loop through every link, in this case outgoing from that object. And then for every object that it is linked with, it'll assign this variable called other O to it. The inner block is actually the block that gets the attribute values of the linked object and displays them in the column. And it does that based on a depth. So you may have used the analysis wizard to create what we call a recursive analysis. In other words, show me information about the object, not just the one I'm linked to, but the one that it is linked to also in turn. And so that kind of logic, the idea of traversing a set of links, is built into the script that's produced by the wizard. And so it's this nested block that actually returns the attribute values. So you can come in here and your intuition can tell you pretty clearly what's going to get returned. So up close, that inner block looks a little bit like this. You'll see a variable S that the wizard uses to store all of its strings. And so in this example, module name is being interrogated. So we take a string module name : and we concatenate that with a value, and we store that back in S. And then if S is empty, we just display an empty string. But if it has something in it, we're actually going to put in the identifier. We're going to construct the identifier with the text string with the label object identifier, and then we're going to display that. So we go through and we construct strings and we display them, construct strings and display them. Now the analysis wizard, in order to make life simple for itself, it doesn't go through and ask you, it doesn't open up every variable available at a given depth to be displayed. If you want to display attributes at more than one level, it'll only give you the system attributes because we know that those attributes are available. We don't know that other attributes are available if somebody wants to display a custom attribute. However, if you wanted to display a custom attribute, you could go in and basically pick up the same block of code that the wizard is writing. So in this example, pro-bridge attribute is returning the object text of the linked object. That's what that other O is for. And then it's creating a label and it's displaying it. So that's basically what you want to do. And let's say I've got an attribute called verification method. I can take that block of code, starting with S equals and ending with else display rich. And I can copy and paste that again, and then simply change object text to a verification method. Now this, of course, assumes that the verification method attribute exists in that other module. One of the things that can get to be tedious about writing layout DXL is that if the script fails, it doesn't really fail gracefully. In other words, it doesn't stop and tell you, hey, you did this wrong. Basically, all you see is invalid DXL or DXL error, and it does it for every object in the column. But this is a simple, safe change to make. You can write verification method, change the name in both places, and then your layout DXL column will display the verification method at that depth. So that concludes what I wanted to say. I went through, at a high level, I went through the things that I think are most important when you're learning DXL. There is also a 2-day course available through professional services. Somebody earlier on the call mentioned some websites, and I'll take any questions you might have now.
George, next question is the VI or VIM editor supported as DXL editor?
So VI, as in the old Unix text editor?
I can't answer that. That's a good question. I think we'll have to assume that.
Yeah, anything that writes a text file. So really the editor is kind of irrelevant. If you like to write in VI, then you're a stronger person than I am. And as long as you put a .dxl extension on it and make sure that you have these single line and block quotes at the top or block comments at the top, you should be good.
I don't know if I hear some background noise. Nancy, or if you're possibly on, can you mute your phone? Okay, we'll try to bear through it here. Next question, George, is I realize that the speaker indicated limited knowledge of the IBM help manual, and this is more of an IT question. Our door server has been moved to a common terminal server as opposed to a local client installed on each of our desktops. Because of this, we don't have access to the help menus or DXL manual. Is there a workaround for making the DXL help available in our closed environment?
So the short answer, so you should be able to do that by installing the help locally in the Citrix environment. There might be limitations on doing that. I know you can also install so that the help menu will actually go out online and access the help out over the internet. Those things take a little bit of futzing to set up. I personally use a PDF copy of the DXL manual, and I also use that old Windows version, that cab file that I showed earlier. I can make those both available with the presentation, if that would make life easier for anybody.
And you can just, the attendees, you can just reply to my automated email to request that if you'd like. Okay, so, all right, so we got the background noise taken care of there. That's a good thing. And because of that, I was diverted on something, so let me reply to this person and let them know it's coming up. The question's coming up now. And that is, where can you find the DXL help file?
Wow. So I guess I don't know of a place in the install where the help gets written. I could go looking for it now, but I imagine you're going to find a folder called help down in the install. If you're installing locally, obviously.
And also part of this, a different attendee question, but it's related to the same thing. What should the help file in each add-ons folder contain? If not answered later in the presentation, maybe you can answer later. So maybe it's kind of a 2-for-1 there.
Yeah, excellent question. So this is something that's not really intuitive, and I appreciate the asker for making me clarify this. So when I created this DXL add-ins folder, I basically went through these steps. So I just came in here and created a new folder to start, and I'll call it another DXL add-ins folder, okay? And then literally what I did is I created a new text file and called it another DXL add-ins folder, and I changed the extension to .hlp. Now, when I did that here, because Windows is trying to help me out, it didn't show me the .txt extension, so I've got to, in my environment, I got to go one step further and actually make sure that that extension is right. And now I can rename that to that, and after I do the rename, you see it turns in the proper help icon is associated with it. So the short answer to the question is the help file doesn't have to contain anything. It just has to be there.
Okay. Bear with me, George. Okay, next question. This person says they're new to Doors Next Generation, and they want to confirm if the scripting language is the same as Doors Classic.
The answer to that is no. So Doors Next Generation is architected entirely different from Doors. Really, the only things that Doors and Doors Next Generation have in common are the development team. That's a good thing because they have a lot of experience with RM tools in general, and then the marketing name. So they share a name, they share a development organization, but Doors Next Generation was architected from the ground up, and I mean literally the ground up. It borrowed some of the same constructs from Doors, so you have modules in Doors Next Generation, and those modules behave similarly to the way they do in classic Doors, but otherwise the technology basis for the two are not the same. If you want to customize Doors Next Generation, you're basically writing JavaScript. I think our consultants like to write Node.js for it.
Next question is, how can we access my Dropbox DXL scripts?
Oh, on the slide, that I will have to get that to you because where is my Dropbox stuff? So these. Oh, Galactic Solutions, by the way, is the name of the website that Jeremy Dick put up. But the where was that shown? The Dropbox. I'll have to look into that. Actually, that Dropbox location was actually Don Cunningham's. I borrowed that slide from him, so I will have to talk to him about how you can reference that.
I think the person wrote in and said slide 51. Actually, two people wrote in and said on slide 51.
Okay.
If that helps.
Oh, there it is. DXL
there you go.
Exchange. I would hope that those URLs. So the person asking, I guess, has tried those URLs. They've downloaded the presentation, tried those URLs, and they don't work.
I can't confirm that yet until they write back.
Okay.
So let me ask another question in the meantime. How do we create a new baseline when the module doesn't have a baseline in DXL?
So the function to create a baseline, I don't know if I can recall that off the top of my head. I believe it would be something like, let me see, baseline B equals create. If I run that, am I going to see what? I'm guessing here, so bear with me. So that won't work. I could go looking through the help and figure out what functions I need to create a baseline, but you can do it through DXL, I know. If that's something that one of the attendees has not been able to do, then I would give them my email address and we can start a private conversation where I could help with that.
Okay. George, are you okay if I go ahead and give the attendees your email address here in the chat window?
Please do, yeah.
Okay, all right, let me do this right now. So I'm going to do this for all attendees. Look in the chat window here and then copy and paste George's email address. There are a couple questions that just seem a little bit too obscure to me. I'm a little bit hesitant to ask in fear that we won't understand exactly what you're trying to ask, and therefore I request that you copy and paste his email address and then send him an email directly, and he can have some dialogue with you. So, okay, so the panel is open, attendees. If you want to ask a question, I can read it hopefully immediately to George, as long as it's in a manner that the general audience and attendees are going to be able to understand, and George is going to be able to understand if I ask him verbally. And again, I'm sorry that there were a couple questions that I just couldn't figure out as far as what you're trying to convey to me, and I'm just concerned that we're going to get lost here with the attendees trying to understand and George trying to understand and get an appropriate answer. So again, please look in the chat box, copy and paste George's email address and send him an email directly if your question has not been answered adequately enough today. So that's going to be it for the questions, George. Is there anything you'd like to say before we wrap up the webinar?
No, thank you again for attending. I hope it was helpful, and if any part of it, if you need any other DXL help, even if it's something that was not addressed in this presentation, feel free to send me the question. I'll do my best to answer it. Otherwise, thank you to everyone.
Great. Thanks, George. Really appreciate the presentation and demonstration. And again, for the attendees that are still on, we still have a number of them. Look for my automated email that I'll send out hopefully later today, and you can reply to me accordingly. I'll be more than happy to send you the presentation. If you want the presentation now, go ahead and download it now in the handout section of the control panel while we're still online. And other than that, we look forward to seeing you on other webinars. So thanks again, George.
Thank you, Mark. Bye, everyone.
Okay, great. All right, thanks, everyone. Take care and have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye.
You know what happened?